Hey y'all, this is Samantha Snyder. I just wanted to hop on and say hello real quick. It has been many months since I posted the last installment of this little audiobook series. And it's just come back into my mind recently. I had a very busy 2023 and very stressful 2023. But even though writing and publishing this novel was a dream from my childhood and from when I was a teenager, I never fully forget about it. It was a really important thing to me, and still is. Writing is still so important to me. And I just want to finish what I started recording this book. It's funny reading back through it. I always catch my own mistakes and things that I could have made better. But it really is fun to jump back into this world and this mindset and read it aloud. Do all the voices the same way that I read to my little brother, who was my guinea pig when I first was writing this book. But I do want to catch you up real quick because it has been a little bit. So if you don't remember what happened last time, Jason was going on his mission to Kadaria, which was one of the oldest cities in Griffyngrein. And it was full of these different classes, a lot of class warfare, a lot of classism. And he had just gotten himself in a really sticky situation. He had gone to Kadaria by himself, and this sort of bully, this sort of mob leader, had met him and really took him by surprise when Jason told him who he was, and tried to show him the sword of the kingdom. Gutschner actually attacked him and knocked him out, threw him in prison, and the last thing we saw was that the sword of the kingdom was just laying in the gutter on the side of the road, and Jason was in prison. Also, it'll be helpful to remember that right before this mission, Jason and Jane and Ezra and Rossley and several others had been down in the Fountain Kingdom. That's the beautiful underground kingdom where they create the fountains that bubble up into the earth above. And they had stumbled upon it by accident and explored the kingdom and had been sent graciously back home by their king. And Ezra had had a discussion with the king about the injustice of the king not doing anything about the complete lack of water that the Terrafungs had imposed on Ezra's tribe, the Ingers. So that's just a little catch up. We're starting on chapter 10 and section 3 today. I know a couple of the people that have been listening along to this, so I'm primarily making this for them. Thank you for being interested and for asking about when the next one was coming out. Let's see what happens next. Chapter 10. Gutschner and a large group of men were soon gathered in a courtyard somewhere deep within Kadaria. Many of these men had dyed red hair like their brutal leader, and they all carried crude, ugly weapons: clubs, rusty cutlasses, blacksmith hammers, splitting mauls. The others, dark-haired men, were very sullen, and the redheads seemed to regard them with suspicion and some contempt. But one and all seemed ready to make trouble, and were united by the prospect of making it together. Gutschner stepped up on an overturned crate that creaked under his weight and gestured for the jostling, arguing men to be silent. "Shut up, all of ye! We've got work to do." "You've said that already, Gutschner," one of the redheads spoke up. "But what do you mean by it?" Gutschner folded his arms. "The advisor thinks he's clever. He thinks he can fool us again by sending us this accursed boy to prance about calling himself savior. But he's tried that trick one too many times. This time we make him pay." The band shouted boisterously in agreement, but another voice protested. "And how do you propose we do that?" "Look around ye," Gutschner waved his arms. "Look at ye. We're a frightful lot, aren't we? We've got weapons, don't we? We're sick of the advisor, aren't we? We're not scared of those filthy Terrafungs, are we?" They were rhetorical questions, and the crowd howled back the answers he sought, growing wilder and wilder. "It's time," Gutschner bellowed, brandishing his club high above his head. "We'll charge the nearest Terrafung camp, take 'em by surprise, kill 'em and burn 'em all dead, and from there we'll take more and more weapons and gather more men and wipe 'em out one camp at a time. And I'll be hanged if I don't smash the life out of that advisor himself before this is all finished." The crowd was frantic by now and surged around Gutschner, weapons in the air. Yes, kill them all." They began to pile towards the courtyard exit. "Hold it!" Gutschner screamed. "We're not going now, you ninnies! We wait until dark. The dark is the best for this sort of work. We'll wait until nightfall." The men quickly changed their chant. "Tonight! Tonight! Kill them all!" One man with a particularly loud voice, however, still had a question. "Gutchner, shouldn't we wait and talk to Nemock about it first?" Gutchner growled impatiently. "Bah! Nemock be blowed! He left me in charge, didn't he? I can't wait for him to come around whenever he pleases. We attack tonight!" The men were satisfied and dispersed from the courtyard, chanting their deadly chant. For a while, Jason lay still in the dark prison cell, where he had been roughly and carelessly tossed away, like his sword. His face had only been backhanded and was not significantly injured, but his side throbbed heavily, and he was sure that one or two of his ribs had been cracked. Most of all, he was too stunned by what had happened, so suddenly, so violently, to move. What did it all mean? It was as if he had walked into a powder keg carrying a torch. There was obviously much more going on in this city besides his own apparently offensive visit. Finally, painfully, his breath catching, he sat up and propped himself against the damp cell wall. He was alone in this prison, which was in the corner of a dark, abandoned room, the windows and doors of which were broken. He heard ominous shouts somewhere in the distance. His mind returned to Gutchner's gloating speech. What had he meant about the advisor? Slowly, Jason realized, with horror, that Gutchner and his men suspected him of being one of the false saviors that Rainiff said had caused so much havoc amongst the people of Griffyngrein over the past long years of captivity. They thought he was the advisor's bait to draw out rebellious subjects. He struggled to his feet and grasped the bars of his prison, pressing his face against them and straining his eyes for a sign of anyone passing nearby. But there was no one. How could he explain to them that they were wrong about him? He thought about shouting, but the area in which the prison stood must have been an unfrequented part of town, for the only sound that he heard was the wind whistling down the narrow streets. Besides, he began to realize that it didn't matter. He had shown Gutchner the sword, and the man hadn't remotely cared. From what he had seen, he knew quite well that he couldn't persuade them to change their minds or alter their course, no matter what the reasons or consequences. It was with a feeling of utter hopelessness that Jason sank back down on the cold stone floor, burying his head in his hands. He was convinced that his successes with the other tribes must have been merely due to the kindness and charity of his hosts, and now a more honest, less naive people had shown him his true situation. What was he doing here anyway? Had he really thought that he could save this kingdom? Now that he looked back on it, he knew his efforts had been futile all along. There was no way that a boy his age, with his ridiculously limited experience, could do anything for these people. He clenched his fists, anger washing over him hotly. He knew it. He had known it all along, right from the very beginning. He had tried to tell them all, but they wouldn't listen. They went blindly on with their plans and dragged him and Jane into a disaster neither of them deserved. And now he was a prisoner, probably for good, and the sword was left in the hands of a rough, malicious people. He was surrounded by men who wanted nothing better than to kill. Nobody could save him. He lay down, trying to find a position in which his ribs didn't hurt him so badly, and closed his eyes. If he could do nothing else, he could sleep. Perhaps he would dream that he was back home, feeding horses on a warm Carolina morning. Here we change scenes. A weary traveler stood outside the gates of the Inger hamlet, with his boots half buried in the snow. His bare head tilted back as he viewed the top of the wall, where several Inger guards stood staring down at him. "A moment longer, please," one of the guards called. "We are waiting for the messenger to return and confirm your story." The stranger nodded and waited patiently, stamping his feet to keep the feeling in them, and looking around him at the natural phenomenon that was the rock wall of the hamlet. Finally, the guard called out, "You are approved. You may come in." A moment later, a guard appeared at the gate, and, unlocking it, opened it with a solemn bow. The stranger returned the salute and stepped in. The gate clanged shut behind him. Silently, the guard led him through the quiet groves, past the dry, silent fountains and the graceful, majestic trees deep in their winter sleep. Then they began to pass houses and penetrated the heart of the hamlet. Up ahead stood the royal house. The snow had been shoveled and swept clear of the cobblestones. Children, playing out in the yards before their neat, orderly houses, stopped and looked curiously as the traveler passed by. He nodded mildly at them, a faint smile on his lips, and a few of them grinned back. At one house, he saw a youngster sitting cross-legged in the snow, scooping handfuls into his mouth with a sense of urgency. The stranger, however, instead of being amused, suddenly looked pained, and after pausing for a moment to watch him, walked on hurriedly. He and his guide paused to allow a man leading a tall, majestic, muscular horse past. He gazed after the beast in admiration. Then they crossed the lane and progressed up the walkway to the royal house. The guard knocked on the door. The house servant who opened looked eager and nervous as he bowed low. "Welcome, sire." The stranger, thanking him, scuffled the snow off his boots and stepped inside. "We are greatly honored by your visit," the servant continued. "His Majesty is not here currently, but a messenger has been sent to tell him that you have come, and he should return any time now. Meanwhile, please let me take your overcoat and your weapons and follow me." The stranger obeyed and followed the servant down the corridors paneled with red wood until they reached the formal hall. The roaring fire in the hearth was a welcome sight. As he entered the room, 2 servants were dragging a small table and a chair to the fireside. They looked up, noticed him, and seemed to be a bit flustered. Hastily they situated the table and chair and bustled off. The stranger's guide invited him to be seated and stood silently to one side, waiting. A few quiet moments passed, and the stranger, basking in the warmth of the fire, took the time to run his hand through his long, fair hair, neatening it, for it was dampened by snow and a bit disheveled by the wind. Then he looked around the formal hall, noticing how simply but handsomely it was arranged. He heard voices talking in low, excited tones out in the hall. It was the 2 servants from before, plus another. The door was partly open, and as they spoke, he heard a 4th voice, gentle but authoritative, cut in. He caught a glimpse of a feminine figure around which the servants gathered. He couldn't help but overhear bits of what they were saying. "What are we going to do, Your Highness?" Come, Denloff, compose yourself," the girl's voice soothed. One of the others said something feverishly. Of course he must. Here, take this. Bring the whole thing, and make haste." He saw her slip something off of her finger and press it into one of the servant's hands. The servant sounded astonished. "But, my lady—" "Go. Do as I say," the girl commanded firmly. The servants dispersed, hurrying off to perform their various duties. One of them remained with the girl, and, as if remembering that their guest was nearby, they lowered their voices beyond his ability to catch their words. But the stranger wasn't thinking about that anymore. He sat back in his chair, his mind on what had just happened. Yes, he was quite sure. He had heard that because of the scarcity of drink in this thirsty hamlet, before any jar of wine or cider was opened, the king's seal must be presented to the servants who managed the storerooms. The girl, who had to be one of the royal family, must have just given her signet ring to the servant, and she had urged him to bring the whole jar, a generous act of hospitality for which she would probably pay from her own ration. Both touched and troubled by this act in all its selflessness, for a moment he wanted to stop the servant and explain that he had water in his canteen and would be content with that. But he quickly realized what an insult such an action would be to the maiden's pride and generosity, and he forced himself to remain seated and pretend to forget everything he had heard. Just as he drew this conclusion, the door was pushed wide open, and the servant announced, "Princess Margaret, come to greet you in her father's absence, sire." The guest hastily arose as the princess entered the room. "Greetings and welcome, Captain Alamar," the girl said warmly, curtsying. "It is with great pleasure that our tribe receives your visit." Chapter 11. Captain Alamar bowed low. "Thank you, Your Highness. I am grateful for your hospitality." The girl smiled. "I fear the hospitality is not at its best today, Captain. We did not know when you were coming, a necessary safety measure for you, I know, or we would have been much better prepared for your arrival. Pray forgive us if we seem disorderly. Please, sit down. I know you are hungry and thirsty from your long journey, and a meal will be brought to you shortly. My father and mother are not at home. They are meeting with the noblemen in our banquet hall today, but I have sent word to them, and they should be back soon. In the meantime, I will be your hostess." Alamar pulled out the chair opposite him for the princess. She thanked him and sat down, after which he did the same. He complimented the Inger hamlet, its orderliness and beauty, and asked a few questions about their social system, which the princess answered readily. Meanwhile, the servants brought him a goblet brimming with good spiced cider, and a meal, which, however hastily it might have been prepared, was delicious. "I trust that your journey was without incident?" Margaret inquired. "Yes, it was, thank you," Alamar said. "In fact, I quite enjoyed it. These woods are beautiful in the snow." "Yes, they are," Margaret said fondly. "But tell me, is it not a harsh environment for you compared to your kingdom that is always sheltered from the elements?" Alamar smiled. "It would be, had I not experienced it many times before. You see, whenever I was younger, I would slip out by myself on occasion and wander around under the cover of night. Even now, when I get the chance, although that is not nearly as often, I return to the upper world. I had been in snow and rain and wind and thunder and marveled at it all. They are each majestic in their own way. Margaret nodded musingly. I can imagine that your world, too, is beautiful, although it is hard for me to comprehend what it must be like. Do you not find it difficult to live underground always? It is a natural way of life for me. Our people are born and raised in such an environment, so nothing strikes us as odd or oppressive about it. He leaned back and gazed at the fire thoughtfully. But I must confess that there is a strange attraction for me to this wild, open world. Many of my people rebuke me for being so distracted, as they call it, but I cannot help it. He seemed to be talking half to himself. But I know my duty. I am captain of the guard, and believe a man should faithfully carry out the responsibilities that are laid upon him. He looked up, and unlike some would believe of me, I dearly love my own kingdom. I am bound to it in a great many ways. I should like to see it sometime, Margaret said. I have heard wonderful legends about the Spring people and their world. Perhaps I will take you there to see it some day, if you like. Margaret smiled. Perhaps I would. He had finished his meal when a servant entered. Captain Alamar, King Terran has returned and is ready to see you. I will take you to him. Princess Margaret and the captain rose, and Alamar bowed to her. Thank you for the food, drink, and good company, my lady, he said. I hope that my arrangements with your father will prove beneficial to your tribe, and that they will allow me to return soon. Here we change scenes. Apparently, it was a day for mysterious visitors. Gutchner watched with disgust and rising irritation as another lone, cloaked figure strode up the narrow lane to Kadaria's main gate. The sun would soon set, and Gutchner had much to do tonight. He'd meet this visitor himself and take care of him quickly. He swaggered out of the gateway and swung his big club ominously onto his shoulder. Several members of his gang fell into step behind him. The figure continued to approach without hesitation. Soon, they were standing within 2 feet of one another. City's closed for the night, boy, Gutchner snarled, catching a glimpse of a youthful face and dark curly hair beneath the hood. Not to me it isn't, Prince Ezra answered, throwing off his hood and fixing a pair of piercing brown eyes on the ugly face before him. Gutchner shook his head in mock disbelief. 2 of 'em! 2 pretty boys putting on airs in one day, he hooted. I can't believe my bad luck. Can you, boys? Which one of you brought bad luck on us? The others laughed jeeringly and pointed at one another accusingly. With one of his savage mood changes, Gutchner swung back around with a feral growl. Off with ye! Away, be gone, scram, or I'll crack your head like a nut. My, Ezra returned, studying him with distaste. You really are as vile as they say. You may threaten all you want, but I will be passing into this city tonight. You hold a friend of mine captive here, and I'm going to take him from you. Listen to him, Gutchner howled, begging for trouble. Let me think about the little brat's threat, boys. Better be careful. Give him a minute. He stared blankly back at the brown eyes. Then he swung his club. Ezra slipped deftly to the side, and the club hit nothing but pavement. As Gutchner reset, swinging his weapon back up, the boy's sword flashed from its sheath, and the hilt smashed down on Gutchner's wrist. The club fell from his hand. In the same moment, Ezra twisted Gutchner's arm painfully over his knee, which he drew up with a sickening punch into Gutchner's stomach. With a great heave, he slammed the big man against the wall and put his sword to the base of his throat. Yes, perhaps I'm a little brat, but I'm one which you should tremble to offend. For the wrath of the Ingers would fall upon you like lightning, he said, in a soft, deadly tone. Gutchner's gang watched with stupid, open-mouth expressions. I am their crown prince, you fool, and my friend, whom you hold in the city, is much greater than I. Do you fear the Terrafungs and the damage they can do to this city? It is nothing compared to what my people could do at the slightest provocation. Why should I believe you? Gutchner tried to scoff, wheezing. Ezra smiled coldly. You don't have to. He raised his hand. A rain of arrows whistled down from the high wall above them, striking dangerously near Gutchner's men. One bounced neatly off the wall, right next to Gutchner's right ear. I have brought allies, and you are no match for them. That, sir, is all you need to know. Gutchner growled, but the boldness had left his eyes. Ezra jerked his head. Come, take me to him, he commanded, and do not be so foolish as to attempt any tricks. We're being watched. The evening light flickered as many nimble, winged shapes appeared and began wheeling methodically over the city. The shrill, grating call of a toothed raptor confirmed what might otherwise have seemed a vision. The prince stepped back and allowed Gutschner to move, slowly, grudgingly, and with many hateful glances, toward the city gate, with a heavy gesture to his gang to disband. Glancing nervously up at the flying surveillance and at the walls from which a quick death would come without warning, they filed solemnly back into the city. Prince Ezra, turning to follow them, caught a glimpse of a large, flat bundle near the edge of the walkway, and beyond it, something gleaming in the gutter. He picked up the bundle and quickly identified it as the shield. Then he stepped over to see the other object. It was the sword. His jaw tightened. How very close everything had come to ruin. Gutschner had almost reached the gate. Ezra knelt and hesitantly picked up the sword. It seemed lighter than it had been when he last held it. Carefully, he slipped it into his own sheath under his cloak, fearing that the thug's carelessness about it might not last. Holding his own sword ready, he followed the men into Gedaria. Here we change scenes. Maybe they would hire him as a kitchen boy. Or perhaps he could work in the stables. He was good at that. He'd grown up doing that. Or did they have horses here? Walker. Poor old boy, he'd miss his master. But he'd still have Jane. And Jane, she'd be very upset. So would everybody. Maybe after he'd worked faithfully for a while, he could slip out sometimes and see them. Just to say hello. They'd probably scorn him. Maybe Jane would understand. Jason heard his stomach rumble. He shifted his position, where he slouched heavily on the floor against the prison wall, and his cracked ribs screamed at him with the movement. Listlessly, he leaned his head back and tried to remember what it had felt like to be a heroic leader, just for a little while. It had only been a few hours, long, long hours, since he had been captured. But lying alone in a prison cell with all of his grand plans ruthlessly crushed, along with the harsh voices, hunger and thirst, pain, and layers of cold stone walls, had worked on his mind in dark ways. He had even slipped off the cloak that he had supposedly earned through the tower test, and, folding it solemnly, laid it in a corner. It was no longer his to wear. In fact, it never had been. He heard footsteps in the street outside. Several people were approaching. He wondered what they were going to do to him now. A moment later, a group entered the abandoned room in which his cell stood. He couldn't make out their faces. All he could see was their silhouettes. They paused just inside the doorway. One of them swore under his breath. This individual set aside something he was carrying, turned sharply to the big man, who was obviously Gutschner, and held out his hand. Gutschner slowly reached for something on his belt and shoved it into the outstretched hand. Jason rubbed his eyes and squinted. Gutschner and the others filed out of the room again. The first man hurried forward and shoved the key in the lock. "Good heavens, Jason," he said with concern. "What?" Suddenly the fuzziness in Jason's mind cleared. "Ezra!" The prince was already in the cell and at Jason's side. "Quentin found me and told me what happened. I came as quickly as possible. Are you all right?" "Not really," Jason said, wincing as he moved to get up. "Come on, you shouldn't be in here a moment longer," Ezra said. He pulled Jason to his feet, dusted the straw off of his back, and looked around. "Where's your cloak?" Jason pointed to the corner. "What on earth did you take it off for?" Ezra asked, throwing it around Jason's shoulders. "Well... crap, never mind," Jason grumbled. Ezra looked around cautiously and then reached under his cloak. "Here. I found it in the gutter, Jason." He pulled the Sword of the Kingdom out of his sheath and held it out. Jason looked at it sadly. "Maybe you should keep on carrying it." Ezra gave a short, surprised laugh. "What are you talking about?" "Look what happened. Look at me. I'm more of a stable boy than a leader." Ezra stared for a moment. He looked as if he were about to lecture Jason. Then, changing his mind, he slid the Sword of the Kingdom into Jason's sheath and slapped his shoulder. "Shut up and follow me, stable boy." Jason began to laugh wearily, and for some reason couldn't stop. Ezra laughed with him too, and it rang out into the silent, gloomy alley. Outside, Gutschner and his men looked at each other with heavy eyelids and stalked away. Jason and Ezra left the cell and picked up the objects Ezra had deposited by the door. The rag-swathed shield and Ezra's own sword, which he returned to its scabbard. "How did you do all this, Ezra?" Jason asked, straightening his clothes, tightening his belt, and taking up the shield. "Gutschner's a killer." "He knows when he's beaten," Ezra said. "He would not risk warfare with the Ingers. Even men like Gutschner know we are not to be trifled with. Besides, I had help to ensure that I got what I wanted." "What kind of help?" Jason asked. "You will see. Come on." Chapter 12. Jason quickly noticed the toothed raptors flying overhead as they walked briskly down the street. "Is that what you're talking about?" he asked, squinting to see them in the sunlight. "Part of it," Ezra said mysteriously. "Come, you'll see soon enough." They progressed quickly through the city, brushing past citizens who paused to look at them with dull curiosity. Ezra was making for the city wall. Jason's ribs still hurt, and Ezra slowed his pace a little to accommodate him, but Jason himself was eager to keep moving. They reached the wall. Jason couldn't imagine why the prince had come to this part of it, for there was no gate, door, window, or peephole to be seen. But Ezra looked up and beckoned. A toothed raptor, circling above them, immediately dipped down and landed on the wall. "Your Highness?" "Tell Halef that we're ready for him." "Right away, sire." The toothed raptor, with his species' unique salute to Jason, immediately departed. A few minutes passed, in which Jason waited impatiently. Then he heard rustling in the trees that bent their heads over the top of the wall. A vine snaked down and hung, swinging gently, between him and Ezra. Then there was a small tremor in the branches above, and something slid neatly down, landing silently on the pavement. It was a griffin man. "Well done, Halef. Your performance was just what I needed." "We're keeping an eye on them still, sir," Halef said. Jason looked at him curiously. This was only the third griffin man he had ever seen. He was dressed in a simple, thick tunic over trousers. His belt carried a knife and pouch, and he wore deerskin boots that were tied around down their whole length in a crisscross pattern. He appeared to be quite a bit younger than either Golgotha or Raineth. His shaggy green hair fell only a little past his shoulders, and his beard was shorter. He carried a bow, and a quiver full of arrows was bound to his shoulders. His left arm was laced up in a sturdy leather arm guard. "The toothed raptors have the whole area covered," he continued, "and if you want us, just shout and we'll be there. Stay out of buildings if you can, so that you aren't out of the raptor's sight, and keep close enough for us to get to you quickly. I wouldn't trust that scum for a moment." "I don't, you can rest assured," Ezra said. "Halef, meet your commander, Jason Fields." Halef bowed. "At your service, sir," he said. "Halef is the combat leader of the Griffin men," Ezra explained. "His warriors have the city surrounded as we speak. Gutschner knows that if he makes a wrong move, one of two things will happen. Either he will be shot down immediately, or Griffin men will drop into the city and do the job personally." Jason raised his eyebrows. "Impressive. Thank you very much for your help, Halef. I don't know what would have happened without you." Halef nodded. "Only my duty. Do you plan to stay here, or shall we prepare to move out?" "That is your decision, Jason," Ezra said. Jason stood silent for a long while, torn between a sense of duty and his recent massive drop in confidence. He drew a deep breath, which his ribs made him regret, and forced himself to reply. "Let's stay. I don't feel right about leaving yet." "As you wish," Halef said. "You may return to your men, but be ready to move soon," Jason went on. "I'm going to look around for a little bit at least, but with the attitudes here, we may have to make a quick escape." "We will be ready." Halef saluted and skimmed back up the vine, pulling it up with him when he reached the top. Ezra and Jason turned back towards the inner city. "What do you have in mind?" Ezra asked. "I need to find Gutschner and his men. He's the last person I want to see, but he said some things that got my attention earlier. There's something up with this city besides his nastiness, and I think we need to figure out what it is. The sooner the better." "I agree," Ezra said. "The kinfolk have always been a quarrelsome bunch, but I didn't expect all this. Let's go get him." Cautiously, they began exploring the city, starting with the outskirts and pushing slowly inward. The sun set, and Ezra borrowed a torch from its bracket in an abandoned street. Occasionally they could hear a toothed raptor's wings flap above them as it swept lower in the course of its patrol, or see a subtle shadow atop the wall, the figure of a griffin man, poised with bow in hand. These sights were reassuring, and Jason started to feel better. He smiled at himself. He could even look back with some amusement at his glum thoughts in the prison cell, although he didn't like to think about them for too long. Glancing at Ezra, who walked in amiable silence beside him, he marveled to himself at what remarkable things had happened to him since he arrived in Griffyngrein, the most remarkable of all being his growing friendship with the prince. It suddenly occurred to him just what Ezra had done today. Had he not once coveted the sword of the kingdom so desperately that he would have killed Jason to get it? And yet, today, he had rescued him and returned the sword without a moment's hesitation. He opened his mouth to say something about it, but Ezra suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Jason listened. They were somewhat deeper in the city, which was eerily quiet for its vast number of inhabitants. Nearly all the streets were deserted now that it was dark. Everyone must be indoors, but why did even the houses seem asleep at this early hour? Later, he learned that in Kadaria, it was custom for the first floors of people's homes to be used for their businesses, be they grocers, artisans, merchants, blacksmiths, or doctors. The basement levels were where the family lived, and the upper stories were for storage or, in the case of the wealthier classes, grander rooms reserved for entertaining. Jason finally caught the noise that Ezra heard. Yes, there were many rough voices clamoring in the distance. Gutchner, he guessed. Seems likely. Let's look. Masters, came a voice from above. A tooth raptor landed on the pavement before them. Something wrong? There's a group of men, a large group, gathered in a courtyard not far from here. They have weapons, and I think many of them are drunk. Gutchner is there. Lead us to him, Jason said. The tooth raptor obediently guided them along. The streets became narrower and were frequented with low archways. Finally, up ahead, they saw the gleam of many torches reflecting off slimy stone walls. They dismissed the tooth raptor, and creeping close, got a view of the courtyard. The tooth raptor was right. The place was packed with men, looking even rougher tonight than they had during the day. They did seem drunk, and they had a lot of weapons, many of which probably doubled as tools in their businesses. Gutchner stood above the crowd and was just beginning to speak. Men of Kadaria, the boy may have gotten away, and that can't be helped right now. But the advisor's still gonna pay. Who wants to spill Terrafung blood tonight? There was a roar of enthusiasm. Gutchner grinned. Good, good. It's about time. What the blazes have we been waiting for anyway? All this time we've been acting like we can't do something about it all. What for? The men laughed roughly. Nothing, they shouted back. That's right, nothing. I ain't gonna waste my time on pretty speeches. I'm ready to get to work. Remember, kill every Terrafung you see. Steal their weapons and their ale. Whatever you find, you keep. It's yours. Burn everything left over. Destroy the camp. Nothing remains of it but ashes in the morning. The men roared in excitement. But suddenly, as they quieted so that Gutchner could speak again, a new voice stopped them short. And what do you expect the advisor will do when he hears of this? Every head, including Jason's and Ezra's, swiveled to see the speaker, a younger man who stood under the arch at one of the entrances to the courtyard. He was a few inches shorter than Jason and had a robust, square build. His hair and beard were dark brown, short, and neatly trimmed. There was no mohawk and certainly no red dye. He carried no weapon, yet somehow his appearance commanded respect as he stood there, looking sternly at Gutchner where he swayed drunkenly atop an overturned crate, waving his big club in the air. Gutchner rolled an eyeball at him. Longley, what do you want? He growled. The newcomer, followed by several others who also lacked the mohawk and red dye, pushed his way into the courtyard, and the crowd parted reluctantly before him. He reached Gutchner and stood beside the crate. I want to know what calamity you are about to bring upon our city, our wives, and our children, he demanded. His voice was penetrating, and the crowd grew quite still. Calamity? On our city? Bah! It's the Terrafungs who are about to suffer, Gutchner roared, hiccuping mid-sentence. That is what you would like all of these men to believe. That is what you would like to believe. But you know it is far from the truth. Listen to me, all of you. If you, Gutchner, lead this rabble, yes, I said rabble, to attack a Terrafung camp tonight, one of two things will happen. Either you will be destroyed by the Terrafungs, or you will succeed in conquering that one camp, losing many men along the way. But either result will have the same consequences. The advisor will send his best forces, led by the 6th Patrol, to march upon Kadaria and punish us. They will surround the city, bombard it, and starve us into repentance. We have felt that pain before. We know it well. You, Gutchner, are not the man to lead the Kadarians in a rebellion against our oppressors. Neither is this the time. Gutchner snarled. And I suppose you think you are the one to lead them, Winston Longley. You must think that, because you won't even support Nemoc himself. You're just a coward. You've only ever acted out of fear. Long as I've been cursed to know you. I'm sure the advisor would be very proud. Winston did not wince. This is not cowardice, Gutchner, he said evenly. This is wisdom. This is love. This is protecting my family and yours. He pointed at the men in the crowd. And yours. And yours. I do not want to see them suffer and die because of the foolish choices made this night. Be careful who you call a fool, Gutchner said menacingly. You're speaking to a royal. I won't take that coming from a grubby little common man. Common man, someone shouted in the crowd. For shame, Gutchner. He is of the family of the guard. And guess who ranks higher? Gushner said gleefully. I do. Maybe it's time you acted like it, Winston said firmly. Gushner turned purple and shook his fist at Winston. He lost his balance and tottered wildly on the crate. Winston turned to the crowd. Men, brothers, for you are brothers, as I have told you time and time again. Royal, guardian, common man, those names no longer mean anything in our broken city and in these broken times. I urge you, and beg of you, disperse. Put away your weapons. Go to your homes and your families and sleep off your drunkenness and your anger. You know I speak the truth. You cannot deny it no matter how hard you try. Go home for the sake of Kadaria. The men, no longer raucous and swaggering, murmured amongst themselves. Winston stood waiting. After a few moments he spoke again, with feeling. One day, my brothers, we will march against the Terfunks. One day, and how I long for it to come, we and all Griffyngrein will be free again. But we cannot bring it about ourselves. We have tried that in the past and paid dearly to no avail. We must wait for the real savior, the one appointed by magic to do this task, to come. Then, and only then, will we act, and when we do, we will act in such a way that our valor will be spoken of for years to come. And perhaps then our honor as a people will be redeemed. Until then, disperse. And they obeyed. Grumblingly but calmly, the crowd filed out of the courtyard, extinguishing their torches. With a word from Winston, the men who were with him followed the different groups out, most likely to see that they got all the way home without trouble. Gushner, roaring with rage but too drunk to do anything about it, eventually fell off his crate and blundered away, cursing. Finally, the only one who remained was Winston Longley, standing thoughtfully in the moonlight. Jason and Ezra looked at each other in amazement. This man had single-handedly derailed what would have been an utterly disastrous plan. Not many could have accomplished such a feat in the face of such a mob. With a nod to each other, they slipped out into the courtyard and approached him. Hearing their footsteps, he looked up quickly. "What is wrong?" he began, but then he took a closer look at his visitors. "You are not from Kadaria." "No, we are not," Jason said. "I am the one Gushner threw in prison earlier today." "Ah, I heard about that, but I didn't know what to make of it, for details never circulate clearly or truthfully in this city. How did you escape, and who are you? And who is this with you?" he added, stepping closer to see their faces. "This is Ezra, Crown Prince of the Ingrid tribe. He and some allies released me from prison. As to who I am..." Jason drew his sword and held it out, letting the moonlight illuminate it. It looked particularly dazzling tonight. "You seem to be a very reasonable man. I'll let you judge whether I'm telling the truth. Gushner couldn't. I am the savior you were talking about a few minutes ago. I know I don't look like it, but it's true. My cousin Jane Kentz and I were called into Griffyngrein from another world. Literally in the blink of an eye, we'd been switched from our land to yours. Raineth the Griffin Prophet took us to the tower, and we passed the test and received the tools waiting for us there. Ever since, we have been gathering the tribes of Griffyngrein to lead them in rebellion against the Terfunks." With wonder, Winston looked from him to Ezra to the sword. "I can scarce believe it," he breathed. "But I know that weapon at a glance. A guardian could never doubt the sign of the sword. The fact that you hold it up alone proves the rumors I heard were true." "What rumors?" "Within the past several weeks, I have heard from a toothed raptor and a griffin man on 2 separate occasions that there was something happening to the south and west. The griffin man in particular said many mysterious things, and when a griffin man has a lot to say, you listen, for it must be with good cause. He spoke of a rising tide, coming to flood the land and change the course of history. And now it seems the tide has risen to my very gates. Welcome, Jason Fields. Welcome, Prince Ezra. I am Winston Longley, descendant of Richard Longley, of the bloodline of the King's Guards. While my family no longer has a king to serve, I see that we now have someone greater. Allow me to take you to my home, where you may rest for the night. In the morning, we will go out and rally Kadarians to your side."